More than half a century ago, Adolf Hitler set out to invade all of Europe. Today, European lands are faced with the threat of a new war. For the first time after World War II, although the conflict swirled on Ukrainian soil, the side effects of a full-year war were felt all over the world. Although the issue seems to be a war between Russia and Ukraine over security, ethnic and economic interests, it turns into a structure that we witnessed and knew during the Cold War period. The Ukrainian war is not only at the level of the European strategic stage, with its forces reflections, current and possible extensions at the global level, it's become the main conflict of our time. The reflections of this war, both at the economic and social level, at the security and political level, have greatly affected countries. In the midst of the ongoing military tension, the current activity on the sides of the conflict, and the lack of a solution in the foreseeable future, the relations between NATO and Russia have escalated badly. The main crisis point of this conflict was the seas. Both the Mediterranean and the high seas have become crisis points for the Russian Navy and NATO naval vessels. At this point, the crisis experienced by the Russian Navy in the international seas, which was faced with a heavy destruction in the Black Sea, is progressing on a much more critical course. The Kremlin is certainly not on the side of causing a crisis because they have a clear front on which they are fighting. However, they also want to make the Russian threat felt. NATO's responses to this threat are always on the table. On the other hand, NATO defines some of the Kremlin's moves as unprofessional and professionally eliminates the current crisis possibilities. What happened in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea the other day was the professional behavior of NATO against the phenomenon that the Russians wanted to feel. The Spanish Navy's high-altitude patrol boat Centinela intercepted two Russian ships in the western Mediterranean on Tuesday and began tracking and tracing. According to a report from the Spanish Defense Staff, EMAD, under the Spanish Ministry of Defense, two Russian ships were designated as the Admiral Kasatonov frigate and the Academic Passion tanker. According to EMAD, Centinela is now integrated into the permanent operations framework of the Spanish Armed Forces, where it conducts surveillance and security missions in the waters off the southern coast of Spain. Its primary purpose is to protect national interests in Spanish sovereign waters. A ship reportedly carrying military supplies and equipment from Russia was seen crossing the Black Sea recently. The report says that the Russian ship Sparta 4 slipped silently into the sea with supplies before heading for the port of Novorossiysk, possibly providing ammunition for Russia's invasion of Ukraine against the increasing presence of the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean. 3 NATO aircraft carriers are traveling in the Mediterranean as a message to Russia in the second year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not slowing down when it comes to displays of deterrence against potential adversaries. 3 NATO carriers from the United States, Italy, and Spain are conducting multi-carrier operations in the Mediterranean as part of the planned deployment of the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier strike group to the U.S. Navy Europe Operations Area. NATO will operate in close coordination with support troops from Greece, Turkey, Croatia, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Albania. It is also clear that the buildup of Russian ships in the Mediterranean increases the risk of an incident. Russian Navy ships cross the Mediterranean in numbers unseen, even in the Cold War, posing the risk of an incident with NATO forces in the normally stable region. We can say that this increase coincides with an aggressive attitude similar to the stance of Russian naval forces in the Baltic Sea. Many experts have expressed the opinion that the approach of the Russian frigate Admiral Gorshkov, armed with hypersonic missiles to the central Mediterranean after the exercises in the southern Mediterranean, may worsen the already complex and turbulent situation. It would be wrong to say that Admiral Gorshkov would make such a contrary move. However, it will not hold back from maintaining elbow contact. The Allies have repeatedly affirmed the right of all nations to cross international waters peacefully. US officials have previously said that interactions with the Russian Navy occur with a certain frequency and are generally safe. However, to understand what it might cost for a Russian ship to encounter the George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier strike group in the Mediterranean, after this time, we need to examine this issue well. In other news, Russia's Ministry of Defense confirmed that 6 amphibious warships that left the Baltic Sea this week are on their way to the Mediterranean, where they say they will participate in naval exercises. This amphibious fleet can swing north from the Mediterranean towards the Black Sea. There is already considerable debate among experts and observers over whether these ships will be the true final destination, which will put the ships in Ukraine in a position to support a possible new large-scale Russian intervention at the end of March. Separately, the Russian Navy's Vishnya-class intelligence collection vessel, Vasily Tadashchev, was spotted crossing the Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean. It's unclear where the ship went, but it's possible that her appearance was somehow related to these other Russian naval movements. Russia said the naval exercises in the Mediterranean will be part of a wide array of naval exercises around the world, including in the North Atlantic and Pacific regions, which will involve a total of about 140 ships and 60 aircraft. In the statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it stated that the purpose of the exercise is a naval and air force exercise to protect Russia's international interests in the world's oceans and to encounter military threats to the Russian Federation. The language used by the Russian Defense Ministry to describe these naval exercises is in many ways similar to the way that the Kremlin describes the nature of large-scale exercises in Belarus scheduled to begin next month. The massive deployment of troops and supplies, including Iskander short-range ballistic missiles and warplanes associated with these exercises, has raised concerns from officials in Ukraine, the United States, and elsewhere. The fear is that all of this may be a cover to put these forces in position for an anticipated new Ukrainian offensive. On the other hand, NATO, by being cautious about Russia's attack, tried to prevent the possibility of a conflict between the alliance and Russia for a while. In fact, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stated that NATO is a defensive alliance after the NATO summit, which was held the day after the attack began. He had declared that they were not seeking conflict with Russia and that they would not be involved in the Russo-Ukrainian war. However, NATO emphasized that all kinds of military, financial, and humanitarian support will be given to Ukraine against Russia, and now it is trying to continue its support by keeping its promise, stating that political and practical support will be increased for Ukraine, which is on the defensive against the Russian invasion, and that support will be continued to help Ukraine win. NATO underlines that Russia is fully responsible for this war, which is a clear violation of international law and the UN Convention. He stresses that efforts will continue to be made for peace, security, and stability throughout the NATO region. The US and NATO allies are trying to take a stance that emphasizes unity against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They are trying to make Russia pay for this invasion. First, they imposed heavy economic sanctions against Russia. Now they are supplying the Ukrainians with weapons to fight against the Russian invasion and empowering NATO countries to make it clear that they will resist any invasion from Russia. NATO aims to continue increasingly all kinds of military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine this year. Naturally, this indicates that it will be a year when tensions with Russia will be high as a result. Although this war was ostensibly referred to as the Russian-Ukrainian War, it turned into a war in which Ukraine found itself and had no influence on its results, despite the fact that the costs paid by all parties have increased in direct proportion to the continuation of the war, and the scenario has become the only realistic solution. Unfortunately, it does not seem possible to reach this last scenario in the short term. Considering all of this war may expand further and may have different reflections on us in the form of a frontal war. In other words, although this war is an ending war for Ukraine, We can also say that it's the beginning war for the Western world. The Western world is trying to take a strong position against Russia every day and tries to prepare its relations with Russia according to a definite but undetermined result. We have entered a very critical turning point in the war between Ukraine and Russia, especially in recent days, as the ground offensive operations take the Donbas region under their influence. The south of Ukraine is witnessing surprise moments. Let's dive into the critical situations in the southern region of Ukraine and the moment of a surprise attack in the Crimean Peninsula, the most strategic center of the war. Without wasting any time, Ukraine's southern front line currently bisects the Zaporizhia region with a center of clashes moving north of the key strategic city of Melitopol. If Ukrainian forces can break through the Russian lines there and liberate Melitopol, Moscow's land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia will be compromised. The peninsula will be isolated, and the Kremlin's control there will be weakened. In this context, it's reported that the Russian army has strengthened the defense of Crimea, amid the news that Ukraine's Western allies are warming up to retaking Crimea after nearly a decade of Russian occupation. As tensions on the front line continued to rise, in statements broadcast on Ukrainian national television, Vadim Skibitsky, representative of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, claimed that military intelligence in the region shows that forces on the peninsula are constantly ready for war, and that in some sectors, Russian forces were seen evacuating. In addition, there is activity in the trenches on the coast, indicating that a marine amphibious operation may take place on the peninsula at the moment. The main intelligence directorate of Ukraine constantly monitors everything related to the activities of the military group in the temporarily occupied Crimea. Indeed, on the territory of the peninsula, the Russian forces are currently preparing for defensive actions. Crimean infrastructure is currently being kept in combat-ready condition by Russian forces. It was claimed that 60 Russian war helicopters were on the alert as powerful land and aviation components on the territory of Crimea. Many of these claims were echoed by the Institute for War Studies, which studied satellite imagery showing Russian forces continuing to build defensive fortifications in southern Ukraine along the Crimean border. Satellite images also showed that Russian forces had increased the number of barriers and trenches along roads to occupied Crimea in Kherson Oblast over the past few weeks. But recently, Ukrainian forces have succeeded in surprising Russian forces in Crimea as the Russians tried to strengthen their defensive fortifications on the peninsula. One of the largest air bases in Crimea was attacked by Ukrainian forces. A Ukrainian attack drone equipped with the Iridium system was captured in the Saki region, which hosts one of the most strategic air bases in Crimea. Sergei Aksyonov announced the commissioning of air defense systems on the territory of Crimea. As it turned out, this was due to another attack from Ukraine, and it seems that Ukrainian military was trying to attack one of the largest military air bases on the peninsula by sending its drone force to destroy the military airspace in Saki. In the photo provided for the attack, you can see one of the drones targeting the Saki airbase. The drone seen in the photo was shot down by Russian air defense systems in the region of Crimea. It turns out that this UAV is equipped with the Iridium system, a global positioning system. According to experts, the Ukrainian army tried to prevent the operation of electronic warfare equipment on the peninsula with this airstrike. This drone attack caused serious concern not only in Saki, but also throughout Crimea. It was claimed that the load carried by the Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicle was quite effective and destructive. Such attacks on the peninsula showed that the Ukrainian armed forces are in an effort to retake Crimea. After this striking attack, Ukraine's representative in Crimea, Tamila Tashever, predicted that the effort of the Ukrainian forces to retake the peninsula would create despair among those who believed in Russia's ability to wage an offensive war in Ukraine. On the other hand, we heard that the latest situation in Crimea will be an inevitable escalation that may even lead to a nuclear clash. The rhetoric is changing as we increasingly explain what Crimea is, what it means for Russia, and how things are connected around Crimea. Military activities on the peninsula are constantly increasing alongside the airstrike on Saki. Russian military officials reported that another attack in Crimea was foiled. The Russian authorities, who did not share many details about this attack, did not comment much on the damage caused by the attacks. While Russian forces claimed to have stopped a major Ukrainian drone attack in Crimea, Alexander Bogomazov, the governor of Russia's Bryansk region, claimed that Ukrainian troops attacked Klimovsky in the post he shared on his Telegram channel. In addition, Ukrainian saboteurs opened fire on a moving car on the peninsula. With the tensions in Crimea reaching such a high level, most Ukrainians want President Vladimir Zelensky to continue to liberate the entire country. According to the 1991 Borders, a survey of more than 2,000 respondents representing the national population, published in March by the International Institute of Sociology of Ukraine, revealed that 64% of Ukrainians believe that Kiev should retake all the territory occupied by Russia since 2014. Moscow demands that any peace talks begin with a recognition of its occupation of Ukrainian territory, while Kiev demands the withdrawal of all Russian troops from its territory in line with the 1991 Borders. Despite almost 13 months of suffering, destruction, and high casualties on the battlefield, most Ukrainians seem determined to continue the war. While 87% of Ukrainians surveyed by KIS say that they are against any territorial concessions, in Ukraine, 9% are undecided. Western leaders, on the other hand, claim that Kiev will clearly decide how and when the war will end. But recent war reports suggest that officials specifically implied that some kind of concessions to Zelensky might be needed to stop the war. On this issue, Chief of Staff Mark Milley thinks it will be very difficult to militarily remove Russian forces from every inch of Russian occupation, voicing the West's concerns about a long and costly war without a diplomatic solution. For this reason, Mark Milley argues that military support to the Ukrainian army should continue and that Donbass and Crimea should be under Kiev's control. The liberation of Crimea, which was occupied and annexed by Russia in 2014 and is now home to a sizable Russian population, is a particularly sensitive issue given its political and military value to Moscow. The peninsula appears to be under threat, raising concerns that President Vladimir Putin may resort to weapons of mass destruction against the Ukrainian military's plans to liberate Crimea. Still, the majority of those polled by Kier insisted that they favored the liberation of Crimea, despite the risk that it would lead to a decline in Western support for Ukraine. Also, 24% of respondents surveyed by Kiev reported that they preferred an alternative in which occupied Donbass was fully liberated, but Ukraine avoided military operations on the Crimean Peninsula. But Ukrainians and residents of the peninsula want to see a free Crimea. Alexander Murashko, a member of the Ukrainian parliament representing Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, noted that Kiev still has a long way to go in order to fully win over its Western partners on the Crimean issue. In this regard, we see a gradual change in the position of Western states, so Ukraine's Western partners are increasingly inclined to support the liberation of Crimea. On the other hand, Kiev continued to pressure Crimea throughout Russia's large-scale invasion and ignored the Kremlin's threats of violent retaliation. Ukrainian forces launched multiple operations against Russian military infrastructure on the peninsula, and even in October detonated a bomb truck over the structure, forcing it to temporarily close the Kerch Strait Bridge, the main symbol of Russian control over Crimea. This attack was a turning point for the Ukrainians, and Crimea was constantly targeted by the Ukrainians after this attack. It is believed that in the coming days, the much-anticipated Great Crimean Offensive will be launched by the Ukrainians. We will see together whether such a striking attack against Crimea will take place. Thank you for watching us. Critical health corridors, right, came from Ukraine. The Russian army was at a loss what to do in Donetsk. The ingenious operation of Ukrainian soldiers in this region drove Putin crazy. Then Putin's threats against the countries supporting Ukraine stunned everyone. But the US response to these threats resonated all over the world. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, one bombshell after another came. The Russian army has accomplished a huge disgrace in the Ukrainian region. This outstanding success of the Ukrainian soldiers will completely change the course of the war. This operation, which is the result of the support the Ukrainian army has received recently, was very important. It became clear that Russia had decided to pursue a different strategy in the regions where it attempted to invade. This strategy was to deal a solid blow to the Ukrainian army. Russians with high combat experience against Ukrainian soldiers, especially if they were pro-Putin, were quickly promoted in rank and became headquarters commanders. One of these Russian soldiers incurred the wrath of the Ukrainian army. Russia was literally cornered to beat this. Thanks to its developing intelligence, Ukraine has started to identify all Russian headquarters in this region. The equipment used to identify these headquarters has been provided to Ukraine with aid since the beginning of the war. But thanks to this latest training, every step Russia takes and all its headquarters in the region can now be detected thanks to this detection. Ukrainian soldiers have carried out one major operation after another against the Russian army. But thanks to this last operation, Putin was dealt a very heavy blow. The Ukrainian army first started to collect intelligence specifically for the headquarters where they planned to organize an operation. This operation to be organized in Donetsk, which has been in the hands of Russia for a while, was very critical in terms of regional dominance. Russia's doubts that we had already occupied Donetsk made the operation even easier. When the Ukrainian army contacted its agents inside the Russian army, it learned that there were not enough security measures. And most of these headquarters, the most important reason for this was Russia's complacency in the occupied territories. This was one of the major problems that the Russian army faced from the very beginning of the war. Ukraine has managed to turn this problem in its favor. Every time in this operation, the Ukrainian army also decided to deploy critical weapons. The Russian army, which had attacked Bakhmut intensively, had directed all the means at its disposal to this region. But thanks to this surprise attack by Ukraine, the Russian army suffered a very heavy defeat. The details of the operation shocked the whole world. The Ukrainian army first started to determine the equipment it would use in the attack on this region. At this point, one of the internal intelligence was that there was no air defense system protecting this headquarters in Donetsk. This led the Ukrainian army to bring out the Bayraktars, which it has been actively using since the beginning of the war. In addition to the Bayraktars, the Ukrainian army also mobilized HIMARS. This once again showed everyone how big an operation the Ukrainian troops were going to organize. The Ukrainian army, first of all, deployed Ukrainian special forces in this operation. When the Ukrainian special forces arrived in this area, the Russian soldiers were cornered. Knowing how critical the operation was, this group mobilized the Ukrainian army, which blockaded the corridors during the watch. Change of the observation units first called for surrender. The Ukrainian army was vastly outnumbered. The Russians were surprised by the call to surrender, but immediately afterwards, not knowing the number of the Ukrainian army, they went for their weapons. Russian soldiers who could not understand where to deploy in the clash suffered heavy damage. But when the persistently refused to surrender, HIMARS came into play. First, HIMARS missiles began to fall one after another on the Russian military headquarters. After that, Russian soldiers panicked and tried to communicate with the Kremlin. But the Ukrainian army had activated jammers in that area. Unable to call for support, some of the Russian soldiers began to flee. This caused panic among many soldiers on the front line. In successive attacks, Ukrainian soldiers neutralized the headquarters commander. The Ukrainian army then took advantage of the panic and once again called for surrender. the Russian army decided to surrender with the loss of the commander's life. This operation was recorded as the biggest operation of the Ukrainian army in Donetsk. The Ukrainian army has recently begun to deliver one serious blow after another. Thanks to these blows, Ukrainian soldiers have cornered Russia badly. It is not yet known what Russia will do, especially because of the rank-and-file soldiers who have lost their lives recently. If the situation continues like this, there will be no commander left to lead the Russian army. Russia will again pay the price for Putin's rapid expenditure of troops. Putin is one of the biggest reasons why Russia is in such a failed period in terms of war. The reason for this issue, which the whole world is wondering about, is again related to Putin's evil plan. The fact that the Russian army was so firmly cornered stunned the whole world. It has once again been revealed how bad the Russian army, which is known as the second most powerful army in the world, is in a bad state. During the Soviet Union, Russia was even considered the most powerful army in the world. But everything changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Putin regime. For a long time, Putin has been having great difficulties in governing the country, thinking that the army might stage a coup because of these problems. Putin has started to take constant measures against this. One of these measures was to dismiss successful generals in the army who could be associated with coups. These were generals who could have been very successful against the Ukrainian army. But Putin forcibly retired each and every one of them. Finally, it was Sergei Surovikin's turn. Sergei Surovikin was a former commander of the Ukrainian front, but because Putin had discarded anyone who might have been a rival, he chose to put Russia in a bad situation rather than succeed in Ukraine. Surovikin's most important characteristic was that he had serious battlefield experience. But what really scared Putin was Surovikin's intense relations with Prigozhin. If Prigozhin, whom he saw as an alternative to himself, came to power, Putin would be in a very difficult situation in response to this difficulty. Putin's fall from power was the beginning of a very big crisis because Putin had been in power for nearly 30 years. During this period, he had committed many crimes and war crimes for which he could be tried. And not only him, Putin's entire circle of bureaucrats would be considered responsible for these crimes and would be severely punished by international courts. Aware of this, Putin gained the power to cancel even the elections if he had the slightest doubt. He even decided to build a very strong army in case of popular uprisings and troubles. This army was in charge of protecting Putin's regime. This army, consisting of approximately 340,000 people, caused a lot of controversy. The fact that Putin, who continues on his way with an anti-democratic administration, took such a measure was actually an indication that he was afraid of falling from power in the near future. In response, for analysts, comments justified Putin's concerns. According to war analysts, Putin was about to face a very big problem. Russia is in its most difficult period for a long time. This period has put Russia into a huge crisis, especially in economic terms. If Putin's steps continue in this way, events will start to come to a much harsher point. And with this, Putin's power will come to an end this time.